Good evening. I don't know if you've taken a gander at a calendar lately, but oh yeah, it's October, and Halloween is just a few days away, so to rein in the spooky season, I of course wanted to read and review a horror novel. I have this friend named Aaron who is constantly recommending me horror novels to read, and so I said, why don't you pick me one book for my spooky read of the year? And she came back with a list of 45 books, and I thought, alright, I'll just throw all of these into a random choice generator and have that determine which of these many books should be the one that I read. The book that came out was Cunning Folk by Adam Nevill. Adam Nevill is a self-published horror author from England. He has had some big success lately with some of his novels being adapted into movies, and in fact Cunning Folk was originally conceived as a screenplay, but I guess something must have fallen through because Nevill later adjusted it to be a novel format. So the story is about a family who moves into a dilapidated fixer-upper half of a duplex, way out in the middle of the woods. And on the other half of this duplex, everything is in pristine condition, they have a beautiful yard. The only problem is the neighbors are fucking crazy. They're really creepy and weird and extremely mean. And right from the prologue of the book, you get sort of a spooky scene that implies that something very supernatural is going on here. So throughout the book, it gets a pretty traditional trajectory with continually rising stakes, escalations with the neighbors, strange sightings in the woods, and it all just builds and builds until there's just a wild climax at the end. So, I was pretty intrigued by this, and, Adam Nevill has a pretty good reputation. Cunning Folk is apparently considered a great example of literary folk horror. I don't know why. Right from the beginning, the true horror of this story is revealed. And it's the prose. Adam Nevill's writing style is abysmal. I can't remember the last time I came across such an overwritten, pretentious style of writing. And often he just lapses into listing off synonyms like he's quoting from a thesaurus. It's like nails on a chalkboard and was constantly pulling me out of the story. And I know that probably sounds like I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, but I have to read you some of this. So here's a part where the young girl in the family has wandered off into the woods and she's starting to get a little nervous. It says, "Not being able to see the house anymore makes her tummy busy with the fizz of drinks in cans. Around her bum there's a tingling, like before a poo she really needs." What? You're probably thinking, oh, deep in the reeds, surely the whole book can't be written like that, right? You'd be wrong, because he reuses this metaphor about pooping half a dozen times in this book. And that's just one example. The entire thing is overrun with laughably bad lines like this. It happens on almost every single page. Here's another example. "Pale and warm like a trembling animal that smells of warm food and should be buried in its own burrow by now, he stumbles." Ah yes, of course, because I wish I had $1 for every time I stumbled like a pale and warm trembling animal. Give this man a Pulitzer. They're like jump scares, because you'll be walking along, trying to get invested in the story, and then BAM! They just jump out at you and hit you in the face. It's like, the bad prose is coming from inside the house, get out of there! The bloated writing style in this book makes everything feel super dragged out. Things that should be described in a single sentence are stretched into a whole paragraph. And because his head is so firmly up his own ass about the style, he forgets to convey basic information to the audience. For example, for the whole first chunk of the book, I was under the impression that the neighbors lived in 2 separate houses, but then in chapter 10 or something it mentions a shared wall that they can knock to each other through, and you're like, wait, they live in the same building? Not only that, but there's a lot of telling instead of showing. But the telling contradicts what we've been shown. It mentions how the daughter has been very like anxious and clingy since they moved into the new place, when in the previous scene she was just enthusiastically exploring around the house. It gives you this impression that Neville is not really thinking about what he's writing, and that carries through into the story too, because there's several major plot holes and confused motivations with the characters. So yeah, look, I know a lot of people don't put that much stock into things like prose when they're reading, and they just get transported by the story or whatever, but for me, I just could not ignore how bad the writing was in this book. But of course, when an author is blindly swinging the bat like Neville is doing, he has to hit the ball eventually, right? So every once in a while you'll hit on a line that actually sounds good, or there'll be a cool concept or a striking visual. But those few shining moments are completely smothered by the book's detractors. Like, let's look at the characters for a second. They're all the tropes you've seen a million times. You got the sappy, cliched little girl, you've got the skeptical nag of a wife, and you've got the husband who is as dumb as a sack of bricks. Like, the book's basic premise of this family moving into this home is ridiculous just on the face of it, right? Because it seems like they move in on a whim. There's no real reason for them to go there other than, oh, well, we didn't really like our apartment, so let's risk our entire life savings on this fixer-upper of a house. Other books that are like this, for example, The Shining, will show you that the characters basically have no other choice. They're stuck in their situation, and that's where the tension comes from. And that's where the audience gets sold on the basic premise. But without that, you're missing a foundational aspect of how a story like this should work. So once things start getting scary at the house and it becomes unsafe, you're like, just leave! Like, why are you even staying there? It doesn't work for me at all. And like, look, I know a lot of horror books are not about the characters so much as they're about the story. So let's talk about the story for a bit. So like I mentioned, Cunning Folk is considered folk horror, and for anyone who has even a passing familiarity with the genre, the story is going to feel real derivative real quick. Like, it's basically a retreading of Pet Sematary with a little bit of Hereditary thrown in. The first third is pretty slow. Aside from the cold open, it's just like petty squabbling and stuff. But then 2/3 in is when the horror kicks in, and you're given something to pay attention to that isn't the terrible prose. So it gets a little bit easier, you know? The problem is that it's so predictable, you know where it's going, and I even got to the point where I thought, okay, surely the author must be misdirecting the audience and he's gonna like veer off in a different direction, but nope, he just basically retreads the blueprint that you've probably seen 100 times, and the one thing I will say though is that at least it's hokey and cheesy as hell, so you're having some fun while it's going on, you know? It gets really over the top, and the writing keeps undercutting itself and becoming unintentionally hilarious. There's like the big shock in the book where it's like, oh, this is terrible! But the characters are supposed to be rushing somewhere, but they keep stopping the car for the stupidest reasons, so I was just like giggling the whole time, like, aren't you guys supposed to be in a hurry? By the last act of the book, I had just completely given up on it being even decent, so I was just like looking for opportunities to laugh at it, and yeah, I think that there is a bit of potential in here. Like, if Neville had just put his literary pretensions aside for a second, he could have focused on making a tight, fun, schlocky horror novel that was like, I don't know, a throwback to like a dime store Pulp Fiction, you know? But instead he ends up throttling all the life out of his own story. At the end of the day, Cunning Folk turned out to be a horrifying novel, just not for the reasons I was expecting. And it's a shame too, because not only am I a huge fan of folk horror, but this was recommended to me by a friend, so, you know, it kind of sucks to have this reaction to it. But on the other hand, she also recommended my favorite book of the year so far, which was Hunchback of Notre Dame, so you win some, you lose some, I guess. But I have to be honest here, Cunning Folk gets a 3 out of 10 for me. I wouldn't even really recommend it. I'd just say maybe read Pet Sematary instead. You know, if you've read any Adam Neville, even if you disagree with me, I'd love to hear your thoughts about him. And I'd love to also hear what horror books you're reading for Halloween. if you're interested in hearing about horror stories that I enjoy, I did do a top 6 horror stories video last October that you might want to check out. I don't know, maybe you could go on there. But yeah, that's all I have for you today. So thanks for joining me. Happy Halloween, and I'm gonna turn off this light here and just leave. So yeah, you can turn the video off now. Bye!